Awesome. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the behind the scenes of my short film existence. We're going to go through the entire process of making the film, but before going into the film itself, I wanted to just give a quick introduction about the various things that we'll cover within the talk and also a bit of background about myself so that you have some better context before watching the film. So, the various things that we'll cover are just a quick introduction about the film as well, why I made the film, the ideas that I had while creating the film, and then the pre production and the production process of making the film, followed by a quick summary and a question and answer at the end of the session. So, about myself, before getting into the concept art and the entertainment industry, I studied architecture for 5 years, which essentially created a very solid design and art foundation for me. And the work that I ended up doing after that really stays heavily invested in architectural design. And that really served as a basis for me to start my journey. And then I realized that after I finished architecture, I didn't want to pursue architecture as a profession, but because the things that really interested me were more in the entertainment design and science fiction, fantasy side of things. So I decided to study at FZD School of Design in Singapore to push my skills of as a concept artist to a better degree. And that was back in 2017. So that's a 1 year course where we learned quite a lot of skills to create a very, very professional portfolio for concept art. And then in 2018 is when I started working professionally. So for the past 3.5 years, I've been working professionally and doing a lot of personal work on the side as well. And the short film that we'll watch today and go deeper into is a product of that personal work that I did during that period. Alongside that, for the last 1 year, I've also been running a podcast known as the Convergence Podcast, where I interview guests from the design industry, be it concept art, architecture, music, design, just a variety of guests who are working and operating at the top of the field. And just talking to them has allowed me to learn quite a bit from them, from their experiences. And it essentially started as a way to continue the conversation with creative professionals while we were all stuck inside our houses due to the lockdown. Now, with that said, why make a short film at all to begin with? Because I think it was important for me to understand this question for myself before actually going into the process of making a film. This short film is essentially my way to start moving from concept art to direction, as that is what my end goal is. And I know to get to a point where at the end you're directing full length feature films, you need to start at a smaller scale first. And hence, I started making the short film. But even before I went that far ahead, the main thing that I was realizing was the concept art that I was making in my free time was just looking really derivative of work that other people were doing. I was looking at much better artists and designers and essentially copying their work and not really thinking about what I want to do. And that's when I decided I should go back to some of the ideas that I had as a student of architecture, where my ideas were unfiltered a bit more by the entertainment design industry, and bring those into the skill sets that I have now as a professional, and basically combine those two things together to create what eventually became existence. Now, what is existence to begin with? This film essentially deals with the creation of an idea and the journey that an idea goes through from its creation through the various manipulations into its final product. And this is a journey that we as creatives can really relate to, because every time we make something, we go through this process of starting something from a small idea and then developing it further and further. And then we inevitably run into a place where we doubt that very idea and then essentially come out of that. And that's the process of existence. But the entire film is depicted through architectural language because that's the language that I understand and I enjoy sharing. So, with that said, let's watch the film. And so that I know some of you may have already seen it, some of you have not seen it. So, I think it'll be good to revisit the film once and then talk about it at a deeper level. Awesome. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the film. It's kind of weird because I can't see anybody on the other side, so I just hope you guys enjoy the film. But that was Existence, the short film, the first short film that I've made along with my friends. And without crediting all the people involved, I think it'll be very unfair to go deeper into the process because it was not just me alone. My friends helped out with various elements and aspects of the film. And the fun part was that I got to collaborate with my friends, and each of them brought in a different skill set to the project. So, to begin with, the music, which essentially carries the entire film from the beginning till the end, was done by my friends Kenseng and Ranit, who composed an original score for the film. And we'll go deeper into the process, of course, for each of these various aspects. And then Ranit also did the mixing and mastering for the score as well, which we listened to in the final product. Then the motion design and the fictional user interfaces that we see within the film was done by my friend Akshay, who is someone who really enjoys Houdini and sacred geometry, and he was able to bring in a very unique set of skills to the project. Now, the character texturing and look dev, as well as the interior designs for some of the locations, were done by my friend Lewis, who was my classmate at FZD School of Design. And he is somebody who really enjoys going into those minute details. And that's why he was the perfect person for that particular job. And finally, my friend Cephas, who designed the facade for the main structure, the exterior facade. Because he was my classmate through all through architecture. He's somebody who enjoys that architectural language as well, just the way I do. And that's why he was someone who I thought it'll be really fun to collaborate with on that particular part of the project. And as we go through the entire process, we'll be talking about each of these various elements throughout the process. But what were the actual tools that were used? Now, for some of you, some of these tools will be fairly obvious, and some of them, if you're really new to the industry, maybe you might be listening to it for the first time. So I thought it'll be good to just go over all the basic tools so that even if you want to create your own short film, perhaps you know what is the pipeline that I followed. And this is by no means the ultimate pipeline, it's just something that I ended up using. And so let's just get into that. For the design phase, it all starts with pen and paper for me. Personally, I like to sketch out ideas, write a lot of notes first about what I'm trying to do, what I want to do with the film. And that's why I always start with these Moleskine sketchbooks and just put across all my ideas there first. And then, of course, start refining them inside Photoshop. And then think about what the next stage of production would be. So within production, Fusion 360 proved to be a very, very useful tool for me because this entire project is so hard surface heavy. Fusion 360, which is a CAD tool, proved to be the most logical way to approach this project. It was something that gave me precise dimensions, precise measurements, and allowed me to be really focused with the kind of modeling that I wanted to do. Especially because I'm not somebody who knows how to poly model with like Max or Maya or something like that, or even within Blender. I think Fusion 360 is a great way to approach modeling for those who don't have that kind of modeling technical 3D skills. Then ZBrush was used quite often to add those additional elements of detail, the kind of debris or damage to certain structures, and even the fine tuned details, which are maybe like edge wear and tear along those lines. So, taking the basic modeling in Fusion 360 and then taking it into ZBrush for the next level of details. Finally, Blender is where all the scenes were assembled, and that was basically the software where everything was lit, textured, rendered for the final pass. Rhino and Grasshopper. So Rhino is another CAD program which is used in architecture, and Grasshopper is a parametric design plugin for Rhino that was used for the facade design specifically. So this is just going to show that sometimes for a very, very specific task, you might require a tool which may not get used anywhere else in the project. DAZ 3D is a great program for bringing out human bases, and that basically served as the base for the character as well. Mixamo is a online rigging tool which automatically rigs the character. Now, for me personally, because I don't have any knowledge of rigging and animation, that proved to be the ultimate tool to get really quick rigging for the character. Marvelous Designer, of course, for clothing simulation. And again, it's like the fun part about these kind of projects is that you get to learn so many new tools, learn things that you won't generally use on a daily basis, but then get to experiment with tools and then kind of improve your pipeline and develop your pipeline further. Now, Maya was used for a very specific purpose during the character development process, which I'll get into later. And Mari was used for the texturing of the character itself. And Houdini, like I had mentioned earlier, was used for the actual simulations of the fictional user interface, which we see within the film. And then comes the post production part of the project. Again, it's like very obvious these are the tools that get used, but the interesting part was that at the beginning of the project I had no idea how to use any of these softwares. So DaVinci Resolve, After Effects, and Premiere Pro were all learned during the process of creating this film. And I think that's the best way to learn a new tool as well, to immerse yourself in a particular process, in a particular project, and then force yourself to adapt to that tool. And we'll get into the depth of why which tool was used at various stages. So it's one thing to know the tool or understand what softwares are used by various people, but what exactly is the pipeline that is being followed to create these assets that finally go into the project? Everything starts with the previs for animation, unless you're working in Unreal, because then due to the real-time nature, things change a bit. Starting out with the storyboard first on paper and then refining it. It was then blocked out in 3D, either in ZBrush or in Blender, based on what kind of forms I wanted to create. And then quickly doing the camera setup based on the storyboard, setting up the camera, setting up very, very basic lighting to get a sense of what I want the film to look like, and then doing a quick EV pass for the lighting. The reason I chose EV for the previs was to ensure everything is happening really quickly, because the cycles engine would take much, much longer to give out the same number of frames. Then everything was assembled in DaVinci Resolve for the primary edit, and then the initial color grade, just to get a sense of what the project would feel like. Now, for all the assets, like I'd mentioned earlier, initial design pass done on Photoshop or on paper first, and then taking everything into Fusion 360, modeling it out to a very high level of detail and fidelity. And if necessary, bringing it into ZBrush to add a certain level of edge wear and damage, then taking it into Blender to maybe add some smaller elements which weren't added in Fusion 360. And another interesting thing is, like, especially when such long projects are being done, you always come back to revisit certain parts that you've already worked upon. And you feel like maybe I want to add some additional elements to something that's already been done. And that's where the additional modeling phase comes in. Rhino and Grasshopper was used for only that facade design. So there was not any new pipeline that was created specifically for that, but rather exporting the models generated within Rhino and then bringing them into Blender. And then once all the assets were in Blender, I started doing a texture pass on that. And all the texturing was done procedurally, because I don't want to spend too much time specifically designing unique textures for each asset, but rather focusing on efficiency across the various set of assets that were created. Now, the interfaces, there was like multiple layers to the interface itself, which were all generatively created within Houdini. But there was also this additional step where I created the models in Fusion 360 and then sent it to my friend Akshay, who then layered upon what he had created within Houdini using the models that I had sent over to him. And then once he had his base ready, after rendering it in Redshift, he then took it into After Effects to further push what the effects could look like. And then all those exported sequences were brought into Blender as a plane, and then it was ready to be used within the scene. Now, for the character design pipeline, this was probably the hardest pipeline to figure out, because I really had no idea how to approach this at all. So, like I mentioned, it all started with the DAZ base model inside ZBrush, inside DAZ, sorry, and then brought into Blender. The main thing at this point is to make sure that the model is kept at the center coordinates of the world space, so that when you export it to Mixamo, there's no technical issue where the rigging doesn't catch the character properly and things along those lines. And these are things that you learn as you do the process a couple of times. You run into some issues and then you understand what went wrong a certain time. So once the rigging was done, bringing back the model with the rig into Blender and then exporting the Alembic file from there into Marvelous Designer. That's where the costume was designed and the clothing simulation was done along with the animation, so that I could export those files back to Blender and then send out those FBX files to my friend Lewis, who then created multiple texture sets in Maya to make sure that the texture resolutions within each character, within each element of the clothing, had the same level of resolution, which was then finally completed inside Mari. And I'll be going through each of these steps at much greater detail, but I just wanted to give a sense of what the pipeline was, to give a sense of how the project was done at a larger level. And then finally, we come to the edit and post phase. All the final scenes were rendered inside cycles, Blender cycles, and then those PNG sequences were sent out to Premiere Pro, which is arranged in the final edit. And then using dynamic link between Premiere Pro and After Effects, I was able to bring out those scenes into After Effects. And the cool thing about the dynamic link is that every time we make a change or an update inside the After Effects file, it automatically updates inside Premiere Pro. So once all the post effects and the dust and the atmosphere, the film grain were added, it was all brought back into Premiere Pro. And then after a final color grade pass, it was ready to be shipped. Now, what were the challenges while doing this entire project? Because this entire project took 1.5 years to complete during our free time. And inevitably, you will run into various challenges while making this. The first challenge for me was building out the team. Like I mentioned, there were so many aspects of the film that I don't know how to tackle. And that's when I had to reach out to my friends, see who was willing to work on the project, who wanted to take out time of their own to work with me. And that's where you have to think about who is able to complement your skill sets to bring out something that they know. And then it's really fun to work with your friends, of course, on a larger project together. Hardware limitations is probably the biggest challenge for me along with this, because close to 90% of the film was done on my MacBook Pro. So I was running into extremely long render times, close to maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes per frame. And that can extremely hinder the way you work as a creative. And that's why it's important to optimize the scenes. And that's something that we'll get into as well. Pipeline exploration was like an ongoing process because I was learning new things each and every day. And as I went deeper into the process of making the film, the pipeline got resolved further and further. And that's how I'm able to present it now as a completely resolved pipeline for you all to see. I think time is a factor of patience essentially, because when things are taking that long, you need to be patient. And because these are happening, these projects are being done in our free time, it's important to realize that you may not be able to work on this project on a daily basis. So again, you have to be willing to drop it for a while and then come back to it. And again, scene optimization, like I mentioned, thinking about what parts of the scene need to be textured, what needs to be inside the camera space, and what can be foregone. Those are things that you need to think about to make sure that you're getting the best result within the 3D file and optimizing the way you work. And I'm someone who likes to plan all the projects that I work on at a deep level before actually going too deep into it. And this is where the project essentially starts. It starts with a simple Excel document where I know what are the scenes that I want to create, what are the various steps involved in creating this project. And I know not everyone works like this. Some people like to work a lot more unrestricted or free flowing, so to speak. But for me, this is the kind of process that works. And this is something that I learned by looking at how other people were approaching their short films. And for me, this process works because it allows me to get a foresight of the various things that I need to tackle as I go deeper into the project. And so this was sometime in the middle of the production. As you can see, the list itself expanded where I had listed out additional assets that I wanted to create for each particular scene. And this allowed me to communicate to myself as well as the friends who were working on the project to know what parts need to still be done, where are we in terms of the production. And it's also important to realize that not everything happens in a chronological order. Sometimes you work on a particular scene at the beginning of the project, sometimes you switch to another scene somewhere in the middle. And it's okay to not work in a particular linear fashion. And that's a problem that I was running into initially, where I was trying to do everything in a chronological fashion. And I realized that that was sort of burning me out, and switching to different parts of the project allowed me to be a bit more experimental. And then finally, when you see the entire project done at this scale, everything is green. It's like a confirmation to yourself that you've been able to successfully finish the project. I think finishing the project is probably the most important part of undertaking anything of this scale, because leaving something midway after investing 1.5 years of your time is a really big waste, I feel. And That's why it's important to plan stuff. That way, you know, if you're burning out, you can take a step back. If you feel like you're in a good space, you can push yourself more. The good thing about creating such a deep plan was that I was able to break down the scenes into interiors, exteriors, hard surface, and tech. And that allowed me to go with a very good mindset into the storyboard phase where I was able to ideate and iterate really well at a fundamental level at the beginning of the project. And like I mentioned, it all starts with the sketchbook. It's important to work on paper first because you're not restricted by the software. You're just working out what ideas you have in your mind. And like you can see, it's like very, very rough sketches, nowhere close to what it could look like in the final film. But the fun thing is that already in this stage, I know I have certain ideas. I know what the project would feel like. And working out these ideas on paper, just writing down small notes, it allows me to see and visualize in my mind what the project would look like. And it also gives me a certain narrative to tell the people I want to bring onto the project, because whenever you want to collaborate with somebody else, it's important to tell them at a deep level what you are trying to accomplish. And that can't be done without having a clear picture in your own mind. Once the storyboard was done on paper, the next step was to bring it all onto Photoshop, clean up the sketches, just arrange it in a good manner for you to understand what you're doing with the project. And the fun thing is that right at this stage, I could see what the project would look like. I knew what the narrative is, I knew what the sequences of shots are. And especially towards the ending of the project in the final few shots, the end product of the film and the initial storyboards look almost identical, only the level of detail keeps increasing at each step. And that just shows the importance of planning. If you know what you're trying to do from the beginning and plan it out well, you're able to execute it seamlessly. Okay, now the metaphorical breakdown of the film itself. This step is super important, especially when talking about what the film should feel like at an emotional level with the people who are doing the music. Because to them, they are working in an abstract sense, they're working with tones, they're working with emotions. So expressing the film in terms of these keywords allowed me to convey my idea to my friends at a deeper level without getting bogged down by the small mechanical details of what the model should look like or what the color of light is and things along those lines. And so essentially I broke down the film into four phases. And these four phases basically track what the creation of an idea feels like to me personally. You go through this hopeful phase at the beginning where you come up with a new idea. You have potential, you see potential in that idea. And then you go through the stage of epiphany where you feel like you've cracked that idea, you feel you made some progress. And that's inevitably where you run into some doubt as well because you question the validity of that idea. And oftentimes the project can go into two different phases. If you focus on the doubt too much, the project doesn't get done. If you are able to overcome the doubt, you go into the introspection of the idea itself because you've completed it. And these are the emotions, the keywords that I conveyed to my friends, and they produced a beautiful score based on that. Now, like I said, before going into the really high level details, it all starts with the previs. And that previs allows us to visualize what the film could look like, what the film could feel like. And right at this stage, the entire film was already done essentially. All the scenes were in place, the narrative was in place, the pacing and the edit was in place. It was only a matter of maybe replacing a few scenes here and there, maybe tightening the edit a bit more, refining the detail, of course, refining the lighting. Those are things that keep happening. But knowing that you have the film at this previous stage is something that's highly, highly motivating. I remember the first time when I locked the edit completely, it was a moment where I felt true joy because I knew that the project was on its way to get completed. It was only a matter of putting in the time to refine every element from this point on. So what I'm going to do next is take you through a series of scenes which give a comparison between the previous and the final shot and just talk a bit about what decisions were made along the process. Specific to this scene, the cube floating was essentially symbolic of that initial idea that we have, the rough form of the idea. Along the way, I decided to drop the god rays that were coming in from the ceiling or from the top because I felt it was looking a bit unrealistic, and I decided to go with a bit more restrained version of the film. But the composition was there, the idea was there, and it stayed true. Again, with the tech cube opening up and the UI revealing itself from the screen, the core idea was already there in the previous stage. The composition was there. It was only a matter of modeling out all the elements and putting all the things together to see what it looks like at the end. And that's where like things like the camera zoom in, the motion blur, the glow, the effects, and the music, those things coming together. This is a very interesting scene where the table is revealed. You can see in the top in the previous the light is getting cut out by the camera, but then I chose to bring it back because I felt like the camera was too deep into the table, rather missing out on the surroundings of the room. And that's when I decided to pull back the camera, allow the room to breathe a bit more. And these are the kind of decisions that you take as you go deeper into the project, and you choose to go back on decisions that you've taken, but that's all right. But what is serving the larger purpose of the film? The composition stays the same, the major design elements also stay the same, but you choose to change the camera angle. I think this scene was one of the scenes where I knew that I had what I wanted from the previous stage itself, and it was only a matter of refining it, like I mentioned earlier. But it was also a challenging scene because it's a very sparse scene. There are not too many details within the scene, so it's important to know how to draw the attention of the viewer into the screen. So where are lights being placed, where what kind of directionality elements you can bring into the composition to make sure that the viewer really focuses on the main element. Those are the things that evolve, and basically as you go deeper into designing the film itself, you start getting better at taking these decisions. Now, this particular scene where the concrete columns, the broken columns, are floating in air or in a ethereal environment, so to speak, I chose to bring in the camera much closer because I felt like I was able to capture the details of the concrete rebars really well. Just the way the light is catching on the small ribbed structures. It felt much more visceral, it felt much more powerful, as opposed to pushing it really back. And also bringing in a slight level of asymmetry in the scene broke the pattern within the film where most of the scenes are highly symmetrical, and that subconsciously adds a certain level of additional questioning and additional value within the viewer's mind. The spiral staircase was one of my favorite scenes because it really elegantly showed the idea that I wanted to put across. The one major change that happened within this particular frame was adding the character in the cube in the middle of the spiral staircase, because I felt like there was something missing in the original previs. The layout was there, but it still felt a bit empty. It felt a bit hollow. But then the moment the character was added and then the cube was floating above the spiral staircase, essentially going through that void, it added a lot more character into that scene. And that, of course, leads into the next scene where you see the cube floating towards the open. And this is our first introduction to natural light inside the film as well. And it's a very pivotal moment because you see the cube floating right at the beginning of the scene, and it's inside this constricted space. And then somewhere during the halfway point of the film, you see the cube emerging into the open light, the natural light, and that signifies a transition from the darker interior spaces into the brighter exterior ones. And that's when the cube shatters against the background of a natural light. The one major change that happened from this point was that in the previous, the window was really narrow and thin. Initially, I didn't want to expose too much of the outside, but then I felt like revealing more of the exterior contextualizes the structure far more and also gives an opportunity to let the natural light come in and coat some of the structures and give a better sense of what the material and the concrete feels like. I think that makes the scene a lot more tangible, in my opinion. The console scene where you can see the UI playing within the screen, it stays essentially the same. And this is one of those examples where right from the beginning the idea stays true till the end, and it's only a matter of refining the idea. So sometimes you might get tempted to refine to a point where you almost change the original idea. So it's important to resist that urge as well and catch yourself if you're getting too deep into changing up decisions that you've already taken. And this was towards the ending of the film where the exterior is about to be revealed. I knew I wanted to creep and close into the cube floating in the facade. But then I decided to pull back the camera a bit and add in this additional foreground element so that it feels a lot more intimate. And that level of intimacy is missing in the previs. But adding that intimacy allows you to slowly reveal the cube that's floating on the facade. And then that finally reveals onto the entire facade structure. And this is again one of those scenes where right from the previous stage, right from the storyboard stage even, I knew what I wanted, and it was only a matter of refining those details. And that's when bringing in the good lighting, the design, tying it all together, stays true to what your idea was but pushes it to a higher quality. The establishing shot of the structure was really fun to work on as well, because again the composition was there, but how am I really making the scene feel believable in terms of lighting, in terms of the kind of scale that I'm trying to sell? That's why adding in certain additional landscape elements allowed me to maybe reveal more of the environment around the structure and make the whole landscape feel a lot more believable. And this last scene of the ramp, even though it's like extremely simple and minimal in scale, I think it's one of those scenes where you don't have to try and mess around with it too much. And at least for me personally, the way I like to view films and the way I like to design elements, something restrained and simple can also be quite evocative and effective if used in a good manner. And then finally, the title reveal of existence stays quite similar. But then the one major change that happens is the way the background landscape works. Instead of having it parallel to the building and parallel to the horizon line, I chose to tilt it a little bit just to add that slight asymmetry in the scene. And these are some of the smaller touches which might be subjective, might be reasonable and rational out as well, but it really depends from person to person, and that's the kind of decision that I chose to take. And again, bringing in some strong directional lighting allows you to add to that asymmetry within the scene. And that essentially leads into the next step, which is the music and editing phase. While all these decisions are being taken in the previs, what is the basis for that? And the strongest basis for that for me within this film was the music, because as you recall, each of these scenes were being cut to the beat of the music. So my friends, they composed the music using Logic Pro and Cubase. And the way we followed this back and forth process was that they would send out a certain edit of the music, maybe 1 minute long or 1.5 minute long, and I would start arranging the scenes based on my sequence, following their editing pace. And then sometimes I wanted to make a change to the edit. Maybe I wanted the scene to slightly be longer or slightly be shorter. Then they had to change the pacing of the music. And in hindsight, this might not be the best way to do go about things, because each time I make a change in the edit, they need to change the music, and each time they need to extend a note or shorten a note, I might have to change the edit as well. But that's how it essentially worked out for us. And this is an example within DaVinci Resolve at an early stage of the previs, where I laid out all the shots inside the UI. I could see what the music was like. I could see what the sound design could be like, which gave us the ambient sounds. Now, this is where I started experimenting. I played around with the lengths of the shots. I played around with what the tonality could feel like, whether we wanted the sound to be heightened, whether we wanted the sound to dip down, what could the mood and emotion be like. So these are some of the changes that I was doing, and then passing on those notes to my friends, who then took on those notes, did their version of that, gave me their suggestions where they felt strongly about the music, felt where the emotions could be heightened better through music versus the image. And those are the kind of discussions that we had. And that's all the collaboration process it comes down to. I think it's a really fun part of the process. And me never having done a short film like this before, it was a completely new experience for me. And even for them, because they were scoring for a short film for the first time as well. So it was like a lot of learning experience for all of us. And I think at the end of the day, that's what these projects are meant for. So it was really fun. Now, what was the design language or the origin of the design language? Because the whole project is so architecture heavy. It drew a lot of inspiration from the Japanese master architect Tadao Ando, as well as the brutalist design language. Taking all these inspirations, I wanted to simplify the forms to a level where it felt believable in the context of what I was trying to portray, but also staying true to what these masters have done in their work. Now, just a quick selection of Tadao Ando's work. It's so elegant, so simple, yet there is sort of this architectural poetry in his work, and that's something that I really enjoy. Just the way the light and shadow works through these forms, it's something that inspired me a lot, and I think it clearly shows through in the final film as well in terms of what my influences were. Again, the massive forms of brutalist architecture, but then the minute details within these facades is something that I really took inspiration from, and then thought about how those ideas can be translated into what I want to do. And that sort of forms the basis for how I started approaching the design. Again, these are just the forms that spoken about, but how do you actually emotion how do you at an emotion level showcase what you want to do? And that obviously comes through the way you portray light and color. So short deck is an amazing website and resource which catalogs hundreds if not thousands of films, and just going through so many of these screenshots by color, by time of the day, by the kind of lens that was being used allowed me a lot of inspiration. And I picked out a couple of frames by Roger Deakins, Adam Arkapaw, and Rob Hardy, who have done extremely masterful work within their films, and finally culminating with a lot of architectural photography. So I wanted to share a couple of references that I used. Obviously, there were far more references that I was going through, but I just wanted to put across a couple of key selections from Blade Runner, from Assassin's Creed, and from Ex Machina, which show this really strong sense of monochromatic lighting and the way it's working out across these monolithic forms. And the reason I chose these frames was because while there were beautiful lightings in other films as well, these particular films showcase the lighting in a very sparse environment, and that's what the tonality of my film was. And it was important for me to see how these master cinematographers were approaching lighting a similar context. And these three images I absolutely love. I unfortunately don't know who are the actual photographers of these images, but just the sheer power in these photography is something that I really love. It's so simple, yet it has so much quality and depth to it. Just the way the light falls off across the surfaces, those slight imperfections within the shadow and within the floor, within the walls. The way the light reflects based on the surface imperfections is something that I really got inspired by, and we tried our best to replicate it within the film. Now we go into the actual production of the various assets, because all this planning and all this research work eventually needs to culminate into what we are making. And the concrete cube essentially started off inside Fusion 360. And because I had already done the research, I had already done the planning for my film, I knew that the smaller cube is going to emerge from within the cube, within the larger cube. And that's the reason at this stage itself, we planned out to design the entire cube around a hollow space. And once the entire cube was done, there was like a hatch mechanism that I designed, which would open up and reveal the tech cube completely inside that. And again, that's where Fusion 360 is really fun, because there are these symmetry tools and the really tangible tools in terms of the measurements to the very specific millimeter that you can go to. And me having that technical architecture background, I really wanted to make sure that everything feels to scale and feels believable. Now, taking the models from Fusion 360 into Blender, just looking at what the camera angle could feel like, and playing around with keyframes to basically plan out what the length of animations would be like. How many frames does it take for the hatch to open up? How can I show the details within the opening of the hatch, the smaller mechanical details? These are some of the decisions that were taken within the camera frame itself. And I just wanted to point out one thing. You'll see my screen switch from Mac screenshots to Windows screenshots. And the reason for that is because somewhere during the production, towards the ending of production, I set up a new system which allowed me to work at a faster pace. And because I'm not tied down to any particular UI or any particular OS, I was just seamlessly switching between the two different systems. Now, just at this phase, at this stage of the project, I was just thinking about what the lighting would feel like. I'm not worrying too much about the textures. I'm not trying to get everything nailed down at one step, but rather playing with various elements, adding the smaller details that I want to. Just thinking about small lighting changes within the opening of the cube itself. And at the end of the day, that's what this what the camera looked like. If you see on the top, there's like a very soft light that's coming in. And my goal for the entire project was to be very, very simple with the lighting. I didn't want to add too many flashes of light. I wanted to keep it very simple, very realistic and believable. And so I chose to stay with one soft light coming in from the top. And that's what it ended up looking like in the viewport. And this also gives a good sense of the texturing process. Like I said, texturing is probably my weakest skill set right now. And so at that point, I was just working with procedural texturing, using some texture maps from textures.com and some from Quixel, but then essentially focusing on using the basic textures, but then procedurally adding the noise, procedurally adding the imperfections that I wanted to. When all that was combined together, this is what the frame ended up looking like. And I think there was a decision that I wanted to take sometime early in the project. Even though the frames might seem simple at the beginning, I wanted to make sure I don't try overcomplicating it and overcompensating in terms of the detail and stick true to what the design language is. Now, within this frame, you can see the tech cube, which is emerging. And that tech cube was the main element of the starting part of the scene, starting part of the film, because you see the UI design animating within that. And again, this was all completely designed inside Fusion 360. In this particular model, the amount of detail that went into the entire process was far, far deeper. A lot of smaller elements were designed, a lot of elements that might not even be visible in the final project. And whenever we're working on a project like this, I think it's important to realize upfront that not everything that you do will end up on screen, and you need to be okay with it, because sometimes you have to do certain extra amount of work, extra amount of details, to then think about what angle works best, what material might work best, and what really needs to be in the film, because you almost might get tempted to show every single aspect of the model that you've done purely because you've made it. And again, just going deeper into the process of modeling, I learned a lot about the software itself, because I was not too fast at modeling at the beginning of the project. But as you see, as you go deeper into the project, and if you look at the version number, it's version 315. So you can see the amount of iterations that go into each of these elements and each of these versions that we're creating. The really fun part about the tech cube was the animation. Because there were so many minute small pieces getting animated, I had to keyframe all of them together. And this was a really challenging part, because the keyframing had to feel believable, it had to feel tangible. And once I was already done with the keyframes, I tested it out, thought about, does it really look feasible? Does it look believable? There were moments where I had to redo the keyframing, because maybe the movement of the casing was too fast, and maybe the movement wasn't believable enough. And these are the kind of back and forth processes that we go through during the creation of a model like this. And here we can see the model embedded inside the hollow space, inside the larger cube, which I was talking about earlier. Another thing I wanted to point out was the organization and planning aspect. As you can see in the scene collection, everything is laid out in proper, precise groups. I like to keep my UI very, very clean. I like to make sure that everything is organized that way. If you want to make changes to certain elements of the project, you're not touching anything else that is already set. And I think it's a good practice to develop early on, even in terms of the naming conventions of your files. Even though it might seem boring at first, having that kind of planning and foresight allows you to stay very, very consistent in terms of quality throughout the project. Then again, it was just a process of framing the shot well, thinking about how you want the cube to emerge, placing the lights in a fashion which serves the purpose of that particular shot. This was like an alternate angle that I was thinking about. Maybe I wanted to show the entire scene from the top rather than from a side on angle. But then I felt like it ruined the feeling that we were getting when you saw the cube emerge from within the casing. And then I decided to go back to the original angle that I had. And this is another shot that I really like quite a bit, because it again brings in that certain hint of asymmetry, which contrasts very much from most of the other parts of the film. And again, it signifies something different that's happening at a subconscious level. These are things that maybe most people may not even catch on when they're watching the film, but it's all about putting in that thought and decision making for yourself, so that you have an actual reason for why you're making these choices, and it's not completely arbitrary. As the name says it, this was the biggest part of the project. It this the monolith structure was in almost 10 to 12 scenes across the film, and that's close to maybe one third of the entire length of the film. So it really had to be designed well. I did a lot of sketches on paper first, and then these are the cleaned up sketches that I did in Photoshop. Again, this is like bringing back my architectural design and environment design interests into the designing process of the structure, just thinking about how I want the forms to be like, where I want to change the proportion. This is where doing that research about Tadawando's architecture, the brutalist architectures, thinking about simplifying forms, this is where all that knowledge and research basically comes in. And then at a certain point, you have to take a decision and go forward with it because there's no end to that process otherwise. So after the decision was done in terms of the design itself, I went into ZBrush, blocked out all the forms, and then brought the model into Blender, where I just threw in a very quick light just to study the form. Does the form feel appealing to me or not? Am I getting that sense of monumentality or not? At a certain point, I was happy with some parts of the structure, some parts I was still not convinced about yet. And as you see, there was a tower that was added behind the structure, behind the larger structure, which happened in the next stage. So once the ZBrush model was okayed and it was time to go on to the next phase, that's when I again came back to Fusion 360. So this time what I did was I took the side and the front angles of the ZBrush model to act as guidelines, brought that into Fusion 360 so that I didn't have to recreate the proportions, I just had to match the proportions. And that's a good way to ensure that you don't end up going back on decisions that you've already taken. And so now this was the step where I could see the model evolving in the amount of detail that I've created, thinking about what are the various elements that I want to add. So it's important to be, again, quite organized with your workflow. Towards the end of this structure, I could see the whole thing coming together, looking at references where I want to add certain things, where I want to change certain things. And a rule of thumb that I generally follow while designing these kind of symmetrical structures is to just work on half the structure and then mirror it towards the end of the process. Of course, you keep mirroring it midway as well to make sure that the proportions feel good. But this also allows you to simplify in terms of modeling time and also keeps the models lighter and doesn't tax your system that much. So this is what the model looked like inside Fusion 360 once the base modeling was done. This is completely untextured, of course, just the basic proportions. And then obviously towards the end, I knew that the ramp also had to be added, and that was also done inside Fusion 360. So this is what the base structure looked like inside Fusion 360. Now, as you remember, during the previous stage, the landscape was completely a flat plane. And this is where it was fun to go back to some of the Quixel assets that the Megascan assets that they have created at such high level of fidelity, bringing those into my scene and essentially creating a believable environment around the previews that I have created and using the previews as a guide and then adding the landscape around it and then testing it out with a really good HDRI lighting, thinking about how the natural light feels across that landscape. And this was some of the early tests where I felt like I was on the right track. I knew that the lighting feels believable, it feels realistic, but I knew that I still had to improve upon the camera angle. I still had to refine that a bit more. Towards the end of the project, this is what the entire landscape felt like. They were extremely heavy models spread across the entire landscape. Some of them may not have been even visible in the camera at the end, but I wanted to make sure I covered all my bases. I had a wide amount of exposure to work with so that in case I wanted to change the camera angle, I had the freedom to do so. Again, bringing in the HDRI lighting, looking at what the terrain feels like. This around this part of the process, I knew that the structure was resolved. Again, in terms of texturing, it was simply a matter of taking the basic texture maps from Quixel or textures.com and then creating your basic passes like the diffuse, the roughness, the specular maps, the normal and bump maps, adding all those details into the structure and then thinking about the larger context, whether it feels believable or not. Somewhere along the process, I was also thinking about what the depth of the scene should feel like. This is obviously not the final camera angle, but I was just thinking about what kind of depth do I want to create in the scene? Whether I want there to be a lot of fog, do I want there to be a little amount of atmosphere and fog to push the background and to push the landscape further back? And these are some of the decisions that were taken in the Z depth pass, because it allows you to remove all the excess amount of detail and just focus on what's there. And then, of course, this is what the final scene ended up looking like. A lot of color grading, a lot of lighting changes were done, but it essentially stays the same, like I had mentioned. And just the small details like the light coming in from the tower, the very, very thin sliver of light, the white, almost like white background of the sky, creating a very strong silhouette of the landscape. It signaled to me that the landscape felt believable, the scene felt realistic. And this is where we come into the actual details of the structure itself. Like I'd mentioned earlier, my friend Cephas designed a lot of these minute details for the facade. These are all renders from Grasshopper and Rhino, where he was able to parametrically create these patterns. So the fun part about this process is that he, using the script that is generated within Grasshopper, he was able to play with the sliders and create various variations of these patterns. And then we brought in these patterns into Blender again and thought about what does it really look like from the front angle, because that's the angle that we are working with. So it's also important to, after designing whatever you want to design, think about how it looks in the context of what you're trying to do. Then bringing in that particular model that's been approved and refined into ZBrush, adding some amount of texture where, I mean, the edge wear and tear, some small damages, and also adding some additional elements to add that extra level of detail within the model and to break that parametric feeling, because sometimes when things are too parametric it almost feels a bit mechanical. So just playing around with the proportions a bit more, and then adding that into the scene itself, adding that into the model of the monolith structure. At this point we felt like, okay, we know where the structure is heading, we get a good amount of detail into the structure, and then this essentially is the culmination of a variety of processes working in Fusion 360, ZBrush, Grasshopper, and Rhino, bringing in Quixel assets in the front for the rocks. All of that comes together. And of course, I'm going through these processes quite quickly because this work is essentially done over 1.5 years. So I had to pick out key moments in the process to show you guys various stages, but then this is what it essentially feels like. Now, the fictional user interface, this was part of the project which I really had no idea how to approach. And because my friend Akshay is a really, really good Houdini artist and a great designer beyond anything else, I wanted him to be a part of this. And I'll talk about what the design decisions were done. But first, let's watch the reel that he has prepared and we'll get a sense of what he created there first. All right. So I think that gave a great insight into the kind of work that was generated by Akshay. And this is where it essentially started. These were some of the really early render tests that he sent over to me. The idea for the UI design was to think about how architectural blueprints, sacred geometry, and sci fi aesthetics can all be combined together to create a really beautiful language for us to play with, and something that works well in the context of the film itself. And the moment I saw these frames by him, I knew that he was on the right track, and it was only a matter of refining what we want in our context. And so the conversation kind of went along these lines where he would send over some frames to me, and then we would discuss about the the parts that we like, the parts that we want to change. So I would send over some notes and think about how we can simplify certain frames that he has created. Sometimes we would retain what he has created, and then once we both were in agreement of what we want to do, then we would go ahead with that, and then Akshay would start executing that part of the project in Houdini. Once that rendering was done, he would export the PNG sequence to me, and then I would bring that PNG sequence into Blender as a plane, like I mentioned earlier. Now, the cool thing is that we can tick mark the cyclic button within Blender, and that allows the animation to loop on itself. And that basically gives me the freedom to play in terms of what the length of the shot would be like. I was never under that pressure that what if the shot runs longer than the animation itself. And that basically gave me the freedom to create the kind of shots that I wanted to while making sure that the UI design stays true to the entire project that we have created there. So just talking about the UI design itself within the project, like I had mentioned, it took a lot of inspiration from sacred geometry, from architectural blueprints, and the way Akshay brought in these minute touches like the cube rotating within that circle right at the beginning of the project. I think it was a very beautiful decision. It works really well, and it really complements the entire aesthetic of the project. Now, the second scene where the UI was revealed, where the tech cube is opening up, the mirroring of the UI design, animation, and the casing opening up was a really fun decision to do because there were two layers that were opening up on screen at the same time, and that gave additional detail to the scene itself. The third part at the end of the tunnel, where we see another screen, basically is an exposition of the tech cube itself from different angles. And the entire UI was like foreshadowing different elements of the project itself within the screen. And maybe some people catch those details, maybe some people don't. But these were some of the things that we were thinking about, so that when we are making these decisions and choices to add certain things to the screen, we know why we are trying to create those decisions. And this was the final scene where the UI design was visible on screen. And the really cool part about this particular animation was that this is where the entire structure that we see in the exterior is revealed, even before the exterior scenes come on. It was an entire foreshadowing of the structure. And if you see closely on the screen itself, you can see the entire silhouette of the structure from the side view, from the 3D view. And this was a way for us to add in those small Easter eggs of the terrain, of the structure. And it was just fun for us to add those small details and basically have fun with the project. Now the interior, there are a lot of interiors in this film, so I just picked out one particular interior that I really wanted to showcase because the workflow stays the same for the entire project. After the sketch phase was done, I immediately come back into Fusion 360 and start blocking out the interiors. Now, for the interior specifically, it was important for me to design from inside to out so that I know what the camera path would be like, and then surround that with the walls and ceiling and be, again, very realistic in the architectural sense and think about where elements are being placed. And then adding the realistic cutout so that when I choose to bring in the lighting from that top direction, I know that it feels believable and there's a logical reason for why that's happening. And then this is what it ended up looking like inside Blender, where we start figuring out what the camera angle could potentially feel like, where the light could enter from. And the reason I chose this scene is because it also houses the console, which is where the previous UI was visible. A very important part of designing all these elements is to gather a lot of references because none of these things are just coming out of nowhere. It's important to gather a lot of references, think about what choices you're making, and then slowly start evolving the process of this design. uh, there are so many great resources also for learning these tools and softwares online. So I was always going back to maybe courses on Learn Squared or YouTube to think about if I'm getting stuck in a certain modeling phase, maybe in Fusion 360 or in Blender, to learn from these people who have already figured out the technical side of things and then just basically implementing it into my project. And this is what the structure looked like at a bare level where only the textures have been added, but then there's no lighting that's been added. So this look dev mode inside Blender allowed me to just understand the believability and the realism of the textures and the materials. And following that step, the moment the lighting was added, it signaled to me that hey, we were on the right track. Then it was only a matter of experimenting with the lighting, thinking about whether you want the light to be darker or lighter, just going through a whole bunch of iterations. And finally, when you're coming to a decision, you stick with that decision, and then this is what the scene looks like at the end of that process, where you've gone through the passes, you've added the light and shadow, you've added the motion blur in the scene as well. Those small details with the camera motion blur really make the whole film feel a lot more cinematic. And again, it's like a learning process, right? So adding those small details on the edges of the ceiling as well, where some more natural light comes in. These were almost like a experimental decision that was taken. It wasn't something that was planned initially. If I just go back a couple of slides, there was no light on the sides of the ceiling, but then later on I decided to try it out, and then it worked out well in my perspective, so I decided to stick with it. Now, the character design, like I said, this was probably the hardest part of designing the whole film. This character was maybe like a 3 to 4 month process where I would work back and forth with Lewis, who was doing the texturing of the entire character. So the things that I had to learn first of all was figure out what the workflow would be like, but also learn Marvelous Designer. I didn't know what Marvelous Designer or how it worked rather. I knew about the software, but I didn't know how it works. And the funny thing is that because I knew I had to only design one character, I didn't really want to buy 1 year's worth of license. So I just downloaded the trial version, and within those 30 days, I learned the software. I exported a whole bunch of animation loops and simulations. And the reason I point that out is to be smart about your time. If something that doesn't need to be dragged on for too long, just make that decision and then execute that part of the project before jumping back into other phases of the project. So once the animation simulations were done, Lewis created multiple UDIMs of that texture set. So just to give a bit more context, when you're exporting a file from Marvelous Designer, you get one UV texture for the entire character and the clothing. So then what Lewis did was he brought that into Maya. He split up the various elements of the clothing so that he could add a good amount of detail into various aspects of the clothing. And this is what the texture set looked like towards the end, where we ended up with 4 maps for the entire character. The way he split it up was thinking about the various parts of the clothing. So the cape was in one texture set, the clothing in terms of the shirt and the undershirt, then the pants, and then the vest. So that's the way he chose to split it up. I completely left it up to him because he's the one who was taking care of that process. And then this is a UI inside Mari, where you can see he created the diffuse map, the specular, the bump, and the dirt to add those various levels of detail to the clothing. And this was like a back and forth process where he would send over some screenshots to me. I would think about whether it's working well for us. Then he would take his own decision whether he wants to go in a certain direction, try out some things. And then after he was happy with it, after I was happy with it, we brought that into Blender, where he was testing out the fidelity of the clothing with the animation and just thinking about how it looks in the context of our lighting. And this particular image signaled to me that, hey, we are done with the character process. When we looked at this particular shot, we knew that the texture feels believable, the character feels good, it feels part of the universe that we're trying to create for existence. And after this stage, it was a matter of creating some fictional frames using the existing sets that I had already created. And just thinking about what the character could feel like, just looking at some interesting cinematic frames to just motivate us in terms of what the character feels like. Especially in such long projects, it's important to find ways to keep yourself happy, keep yourself engaged, because quite often the task becomes monotonous, and it's about finding these ways to boost yourself, boost the entire team, and get really excited about the project. And that finally comes to the last part of the process of making a short film, which is the post production. This is what the typical breakdown of the scene would look like. I'm not somebody who likes to render out a whole bunch of passes. I was just trying to be very, very efficient. Like I'd mentioned earlier, it's all about efficiency. getting as close to the final quality within Blender itself in the diffuse and the beauty pass, and then bringing in the Z depth pass and the ambient occlusion pass to add that extra layer of detail and fidelity to the scene. This is a typical UI within Premiere Pro. The reason I could arrange it really quickly is because I had already done the harder part of creating the edit inside DaVinci Resolve, and it was only a matter of recreating that edit inside Premiere Pro. The reason I chose to come back to Premiere Pro was because of the live link, where after it was assembled inside Premiere Pro, I could just create a live link with After Effects and then make all the changes that I wanted to make for the scene, and then use the various passes that were created inside Blender, and then add those layers of atmosphere, those layers of color grading, and allow that to get automatically updated into Premiere Pro. And finally, at the end of it all, what were the key takeaways of a project like this? There's so many lessons, especially in a project which is spanning 1.5 years. And the things that I really learned from this was having a clear idea of what you're trying to do, ideating upon your own original concept, thinking about why you were trying to do this, planning it out really well right from the beginning so that you know how much work might go into this entire project. Creating good pipelines, it's it gets easier as you do it more often. Now for my next short film, it'll be easier for me to create the pipeline because I already know what kind of issues I might run into. And then thinking about design, it all comes down to this because as a visual artist, design is something that's quite important to me. So that's the reason I chose to incorporate this as a key takeaway. Thinking about design, thinking about how one aspect of the design works in conjunction with the other one and how it all works together. Now, what is the narrative? The narrative is in terms of storytelling, narrative is in terms of camera positioning, in terms of the music, how is it all working together, especially in an abstract film where there are no dialogues to really create some sort of exposition and explain what the story could be like. Patience and consistency, I think these two work well together. Without patience and consistency, there is no way a project like this can get done. And it's extremely important to be patient with yourself as well and not over expect and overestimate the amount of work that you can put in terms of these personal projects. And just consistently working on a little portion of the film every day by having that planning in mind allows you to completely finish the project in a successful manner. And I think with that said, I thank you all for this opportunity. I hope you all learned something from this. And, you know, I hope you guys make your own short films.